whatever you're doing at the time, do it as if it's the most important thing in the world.
Welcome to ANA Investigates, a monthly podcast covering the latest in neurology and neuroscience brought to you by the American Neurological Association. This month, we'll explore the career path of one of the most inspiring leaders in our field. I'm your host, Adeline Goss.
And I'm Romer Geocadin. I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Walter Koroshetz live at the ANA 2019 meeting in St. Louis.
Hi, I'm Dr. Walter Koroshetz. I'm the director of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the National Institutes of Health.
Before working at the NINDS, Walter was the director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Neurointensive Care Unit. He was also the Neurology Residency Training Director at MGH. And prior to that, he did bench investigation in Huntington's disease at Harvard Medical School. But we started our interview even further back, with a particular interesting career origin story. Walter said his love of neuroscience was sparked on a rainy day in Flatbush, Brooklyn.
I can't remember exactly how old I was. I might have been maybe a freshman in high school or maybe an eighth grader, but on rainy days in Brooklyn, there wasn't much you could do except, go to the library. Maybe Grand Army Plaza had this fantastic library. But anyway, I went to the local library one day where I had taken out many, many books, and I was going through the stacks, and there was like the biggest book I had ever seen. And so I said, well, I got to see what that is, a big black book. And I took it down, and it was Friedman's psychiatry text. Not sure what it was doing in the public library, but there it was. It must have been like 1,000 pages. But it looked interesting. So I took it home and started reading it, the first chapter. And the first chapter was, so this is a book about psychiatry. Like how does the brain work? How do people get into these psychiatric illnesses, which was so mysterious? But the first chapter was about ion transport across membranes that create the action potential. And I got like so amazed that our brains were working by ion movement across membranes that allowed neurotransmission. So I never got past the first chapter. I basically got interested in membrane biology as a high school student and biophysics of how that happens. And that led to basically multiple projects in college where I got summer jobs in labs studying ion transport. First, of course, frog skin, then, of course, cornea. And then when I got to med school, I got into a lab that was studying ion transport across lipid membranes. So that's kind of how it happened. It's a very strange story, which I trace back to a psychiatry textbook in the library. Now, maybe it's not true, but that's what I remember.
So, Walter, you have been very successful in your career as a lab investigator, to clinical educator, and as a clinician also, and now as the administrator of the largest funder of neurological research. How did you manage switching from one role to the other role, which seemed very distinct?
It seemed natural to me at the time, so it wasn't like jumping, as more of being swayed by the science. So as an example, so I was in the laboratory doing pretty cutting edge techniques for electrophysiology. Patch clamping had just come out. I was one of the first people to start patch clamping cultured neurons, and it was really exciting. We were working on the idea that excitotoxicity was a driver of cell death in Huntington's. And so, working in the lab with the cells, you always think to yourself, well, how do I know this is really relevant to Huntington's disease? And so the idea would be a mismatch between energy requirements and energy availability. And so in that case, one might expect there would be increased glycolytic metabolism and elevated lactate, as you see in the culture dish. So in talking about it, it turned out that there was a friend who was doing MR spectroscopy so they could actually measure lactate in the brain of living people. And so we said, well, why don't we check and see if it that occurs in Huntington's, and lo and behold, there was a gigantic lactic acid peak in the Huntington's patient, the first one we did. And so that was something that I was, as I said, it seemed like, well, that's really important. And so moving into spectroscopy in Huntington's disease was a natural shift, and that got me into the imaging space. And at the time at Mass General, there were techniques in the MR space at the Martino Center, where people were developing technologies like diffusion-weighted imaging on the whole brain, and perfusion imaging on the whole brain. And so we were the first to be able to do a combined perfusion-diffusion imaging. And so it was that entry into the MR world in Huntington's that started using the technology for stroke, and that turned out to be a fantastic advance. And now it's used pretty commonly across the country to identify patients for intraarterial lysis. So we actually started intraarterial lysis soon after we had the MR technologies. And in those days, we were using urokinase, but I had a patient, the first one I did, who was a basilar thrombosis and locked in, and after the urokinase was completely normal and walked out of the hospital. So, as I said, well, that seemed to be really important. And so that, moved me much more into imaging-based stroke therapy, particularly intraarterial, going through urokinase, TPA, clot retrieval devices, and it was really exciting. So I kind of felt like I was always kind of riding the wave.
Was there any particularly good advice you received in the course of your career?
There was a PhD scientist named Chuck Stevens, physiologist, very well respected. I remember we were sitting around a table when he visited the lab, and he said, always do what you think is the most important thing at the time. So the idea being that, you really want to do things that you feel really passionate about, that they're incredibly important. And so that's the one piece of advice. And then the other piece of advice came from C. Miller Fisher, who was also a very influential mentor for me. And he said, whatever you're doing at the time, do it as if it's the most important thing in the world. So if you put those two things together, you really can move from one thing to the other, as I did. But each one of those activities was incredibly fulfilling, and I always felt like it was, the most important thing at the time that I could do.
What advice would you give to ANA members who aspire to be in any one of these roles or all of these roles?
The people you want to aspire to, one characteristic of them is that they never aspire to be anybody. So this came up, conversations about Dr. Fisher among our, people who knew him. He was just the most amazing neurologist. And so if you were thinking of aspiring to be like Dr. Fisher, you lost automatically, because the inherent quality of Fisher was he never aspired to be anybody else. So I think what I would tell people is just follow those two pieces of advice. Find out what you really love to do, what you're really passionate about, and then focus down, become a superb expert in doing that, and do it as though it's the most important thing in the world. But then always keep your eye out for how science changes, so that you can move to the next most important thing in the world for you.
What are some of the mistakes that you've made and the important lessons that you've learned along the way?
I think the mistakes I made are generally when I either chose people to work in the lab that were just not going to work out, and I couldn't quite figure out how to either move them on and get somebody else. But I think learning how to manage a lab was something we weren't taught, and so there I think I definitely made some mistakes which held me back. I think the other, the mistakes that I, still wake up at night are, I can still remember patients that things didn't go well. And I think those mistakes, haunt you forever. And I guess the other thing which was always difficult uh, for me was trying to balance work-life balance. So um, I, incredibly fortunate. I have 5 wonderful children, and but my wife went through uh, a lot of misery because I wasn't around as much as I should have been, and so I think going backwards, I would have tried to rectify that some, but yeah, I was clearly a workaholic, so that might have been a mistake. But luckily, she's stuck by.
Do you think the career pathways in academic neurology have changed significantly since you finished your training?
Well, I think that there's two ways of looking at that, and that is one is kind of the sociological changes that have occurred, and sure, they've been pretty significant over my career. I think it's certainly a lot harder now to be broad. There's just so much that's happened in neuroscience. So when I started, Dr. Adams, who wrote the textbook on neurology, basically knew everything about neurology. I mean, it was pretty clear that there wasn't anything he didn't know. And I don't think there's anybody who can do that anymore because there's way too much to know. So that certainly changed things. We have tools now that we never had before, technologies, things like we never had before. But the essence of the career is still trying to advance the science and take care of patients. And so I think everything else is more like frills to me around the edges than that kind of central theme.
How do you think we could better support the careers of budding academic neurologists?
So I think the trick is simply to get people to see areas of neurology that become so important to them that they're going to hook their career on it. You never know when that spark is going to be triggered. It could be in college or high school age, where people try to figure out who they're going to be, what kind of person they're going to be. The other opportunity we have as neurologists is the medical students. When I was a student at the University of Chicago, there was a neurologist, Douglas Buchanan, who was, I think, the first pediatric neurologist in the United States. So he was very senior. And for some reason, every Saturday morning, he would bring a patient into the auditorium and he would do a history and exam. And he was such a great person that people would just get up on Saturday morning and go and sit in the auditorium and get hooked on neurology. So it wasn't a course. It wasn't, it was in no book. He just kind of did it. So those kind of things to get at the medical students, I think, are really very valuable. And then when you have people who decide on neurology, then the question is, how to help them see, how they can best contribute to the field. And that's complicated because there you have lots of different competing agendas. And I think, you want people to do what they want to do. You don't want to force somebody to do something that they don't think is that important. You want people to do what's most important, whether it's, having a family and, having a great private practice. That's what's most important. That's what they should do. I would say that you'll feel bad if there's somebody who really wants to make advances in research, but for some reason feels like they don't. It's not possible for them. So they want to do it, but the logistics aren't working out somehow. And that, I think, we have to figure out how to change the logistics. And I think particularly for women in neurology, there are clear barriers that they're facing that the men are not facing, and we need to kind of break those barriers down so they can do what they want to do. So I think trying to at least pave the path so everyone gets a chance to try what they really think is important, I think is something we have to keep working on.
After the NINDS directorship, what do you envision as the next phase for Dr. Walter Koroshetz?
For me, it's still, as I said, it's the most important position I can think about. I can't really think about anything that's more important to me. I can focus purely on the science, the workforce of science, the actual science that's being done, the new projects we have. Are so exciting. The HEAL initiative in pain, the brain initiative, the big initiatives in dementia research. So I have no thoughts about doing anything different. I guess if I felt like I wasn't, up to form in performing as I get older, the things I'd like to do is maybe give back to some of the universities, if I can, that help me and that I feel really close to. But that's the only thing I've ever thought about.
Any last comments?
What I usually end up with when I talk to the young trainees, and my motto is taken from one of my favorite movies, Galaxy Quest: never give up, never surrender.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you.
That was Romer Geocadin speaking to Dr. Walter Koroshetz, director of the NINDS, about his career path in neurology. Megan Ritchie contributed to the production of this episode. For ANA Investigates, I'm Adeline Goss.
This has been an episode of ANA Investigates, the official podcast of the American Neurological Association. Thanks for joining us. To learn more about today's program and to access more of the incredible content produced by the ANA, check out myana.org. Adeline Goss is our host. Our producers are Romer Geocadin, Adeline Goss, Michael Halstead, Megan Ritchie, and Jim Sigler. Our editor is Jen Hurley. If you'd like to learn more about receiving CME credit for listening to ANA Investigates, visit myana.org and navigate to ANA Investigates under the Education tab. For more information not covered in today's program, check out the official summary of this episode, published in one of the ANA's journals, the Annals of Neurology or the Annals of Clinical and Translational Neurology. Copyright, the American Neurological Association.